very much for this nice introduction. I think with the artificial placenta, I won't get us out of work. Will still take quite a while. Maybe first a quick technical check. Can you hear me and can you see my slides? Is there feedback? Yeah, okay, I get a WhatsApp. Just let me see. Can you lower your camera? You in this way? Quick check. Otherwise, I would start, unless Hisham, you give me a hint that I need to correct something.
I wonder whether it's possible. I don't know.
Sorry?
Just bear with us, please, Dr. Chris. Our IT guys running around making it right.
So am I good to go or not? Sorry.
Just give us 1 or 2 more minutes. We're trying to minimize. There we go. You are all good to go. Thank you.
Good to. Okay. Thanks a lot. So thank you also for inviting me to this conference. I'm sorry that I cannot be there physically in person, which I would have loved to do because I love your country. It's really great to be there. But unfortunately, because of my mom's issues, but she's doing well now. I'm at her home. Okay, my talk is target fortification of human milk for preterm infant, and you will hear a little bit about what we were doing research on for the last 10 years. This is my disclosure, and the objective of my talk is to review underlying principles of growth and nutrition. Sorry, I need to take this away. Of growth and nutrition for preterm infants, to understand reasons for postnatal growth restriction, to discuss strengths and weaknesses of human milk diet for ELBW preterm born infants, and to compare different fortification strategies of human milk to improve nutrient intake and growth. This is a number of publications just with fortification and preterm over the last 22 years. You see there's a quite remarkable increase of publications indicating a kind of shift towards more interest in growing and nurturing preemie babies to improve their outcome once they've been stabilized with their cardiopulmonary adaptation and postnatal adaptation. So this is what we should do. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that preterm infants achieve rates of growth and composition of weight gain for a normal fetus of the same postmenstrual age and to maintain normal concentrations of blood and tissue nutrients. This is one sentence and it's easier said than done. So finally, we have to make the baby grow after postnatal adaptation on one of these percentiles, which is not fully understood yet. We have worked a lot on that the last years, but that's beyond the topic of this talk. Maybe we can talk about this in the next years. So we need to make the baby grow somehow here. Second thing is we need to make organs differentiate. You see here the brain of a 24-weeker, and this is the brain of a 42-weeker. You do not only see an increase in size, but you also see a difference in structure, much more surface, much more myelination, and the baby needs to get the right nutrients so that this development can happen. Because finally, it's all about the brain, how you will function in later life. Then the third thing, what we need to do is we need to have the right quality of weight gain in terms of body composition. You see here 2 graphs, one from Kramer, one from Ziegler, from different eras, found with different methods, but basically showing the same, that the baby's linear accretion of lean mass is here. That's the blue and the H2O part. This is lean mass. It's relatively linear, and there's an accretion of fat mass starting beyond 30 weeks, preparing the baby for postnatal metabolic stress and adaptation to postnatal life. We need to keep that in mind, and this quality of weight gain is important. We cannot do too low, we cannot do too much, because otherwise we will have an early onset of adult diseases like atherosclerosis, metabolic diseases, cardiovascular insults, and so on. We should minimize that. Data on that are not very strong yet, but we are getting more and more data on that as well. So how does growth and neurodevelopmental work together? You see this study of Rich Ehrenkrantz. He did 4 quartiles of a multi-center cohort retrospective analysis of babies below 1,000 grams. And you see in each group there are around 125 babies. And these are the slow growers, these are the fast growers. And then he correlated it with neurodevelopmental at discharge, which you see here, and at 18 to 22 months. And you see there is a dependency on how you grow and what your later neonatal or neurological outcome is, not only at discharge, but also at later life. So growth and neurodevelopment work together somehow. Here is another study about how brain growth correlates with neurodevelopmental outcome. This is a study comparing, on one hand, around term babies with normal head circumference and with reduced small head circumference. And then the third group are babies with a reduced head circumference but showing a catch-up growth, and that is this group here until follow-up 2 years, and here 6 years, and also until adult life. And what you see here is those babies who have a small head and remain below there in the percentiles, the neurodevelopmental outcome is poorer than those who also start slow but then catch up to normal brain growth. They have a normal IQ compared to term babies with a normal head circumference. So brain size matters in terms of later functionality. How does growth of brain size and so head circumference, length, and weight gain correlate? Because measuring head circumference is not so easy on a daily basis and also not helpful. So we need to have another proxy. And you see here that the rate of weight gain in gram per kilogram per day, it's from the same study, I did this analysis, and the growth of length and head circumference in centimeters per week correlate nicely in a linear way. So that means if you make a baby grow and with a good weight gain, then most likely the growth of your head circumference is also higher, and maybe that relates to better outcome. Actually, we have no better predictor for later neurodevelopmental outcome than the rate of head growth. But to guide it in clinical routine, we cannot use head circumference only, but we need to take weight gain. This was the main message from what I wanted to tell you here. So how does neurodevelopmental outcome relate to nutritional intake? This is a study of Stevens that was done in 124 ELBW babies, and they looked into MDI in later life, and they found that each kilocalorie per kilogram per day that you can increase in the first week of life increases the MDI by 0.46 points. And each gram protein per kilogram per day that you manage to provide the baby more with increases the MDI by 8.2 points. That is a huge effect size, which is probably in the same range as those of classical procedures and strategies applied during the intensive care period of preterm babies, like kind of ventilation that we give and others. So how do we do in neonatal medicine our job in making babies grow the right way? This is a paper just as an example. How we have which growth rates we get, and you see here that most babies deviate from the intrauterine percentile, and the deviation gets bigger and bigger towards the end, towards discharge. And you see here that in this study 33% are SGA at birth, and 63% are growth restricted at discharge. If we look into a network data from Vermont Oxford Neonatal Network, where some of you might be in, then you see here from the network that 25.4% were small for gestation age as being below the 10th percentile at admission, and 53% are below the 10th percentile. at discharge, and even 30.9% are below the 3rd percentile. So it means we as neonatologists not always do a good job in terms of making babies grow the right way. So how does nutrient intake and growth correlate? This is a study or a compilation of studies where we have protein intake here measured versus nitrogen retention. This is from balance studies, and nitrogen retention relates to the growth of lean mass, like here 200 milligrams of nitrogen retention equal 10 grams of growth. So 400 is about 20 grams per kilogram per day of growth. And you see that there is a linear relationship of protein intake and growth. And interestingly, you need to have 1 gram per kilogram per day to cover the losses that you have usually. And then it goes linearly up. So if you are below 1, then you will lose lean mass, you will not grow. And depending on how more you give, your growth rates will be higher. And it's basically a linear, relative linear relationship. But it's not only about protein intake, it's also about energy intake. Here on the x-axis, you see the metabolizable energy intake in kilocalories per kilogram per day. On the y-axis here, you see the protein gain in gram per kilogram per day. You can multiply this with a factor of 6, roughly, then you get the weight gain. And here you see the protein net intake in gram per kilogram per day. And let's go here to this 2.5 gram per kilogram per day. Then you see that if you give the baby all the time 2.5 and you do not give enough energy, then the baby will stay below its optimum growth rate, which is around here. Here, if you increase the metabolizable energy, it does not lead to more protein gain. Why? That is relatively easy, because all building blocks here are already used. And if you increase now more energy, then the baby will still gain weight, but that will be mostly fat mass, which is beyond a certain amount, maybe not very healthy. So if you want to increase growth here, then you need to increase protein, but always keep in mind that you need to have a matched balance with energy intake. I mean, nowadays, most neonatologists are aware of protein intake, but you also need to be aware of the energy intake. Why? Because we, from amino acids here, these two ones, to make protein synthesis here, to build up amino acid chains, needs energy. And if we don't have that, then we get a pathway of amino acid breakdown, which basically strips off the nitrogen from the carbon skeleton to go into gluconeogenesis. And then lots of urea is produced, which is an unfavorable pathway because it's a strong osmolyte, it's energy consuming and water consuming to get it out of the body. So we should avoid that, and that only works if we have enough energy on board. And in utero, this is not as critical because there's practically unlimited clearance through the placenta. That's why babies receive relatively, fetuses receive a big amount of amino acids, but after birth, this unlimited amount doesn't help us. We need enough energy. Now, lots have changed since 1985, where we had formula intact cow's milk protein and maybe extensively hydrolyzed, and now lots of things have come on the market as well. So neonatologists need to know when to use what, we need to know when do we use what kind of ventilation as well, and that makes life a little bit more complicated. Obviously, we would like to nurture babies, preterm babies, ideally with breast milk. It lots of positive things like oligosaccharides. It's positive for the microbiome. It protects against sepsis and necrotizing enterocolitis. It's not too expensive, but the macronutrient composition is very variable and not balanced. And it is generally too low for preterm infants. If you look at this graph, then you see here the gestational age and the weight gain here in absolute weight, the 50th percentile. Here you see the weekly weight gain in gram per week, and here the weight gain in gram per kilogram per day. And you see that preemie babies here have a much higher weight rate, 15 to 20, in part even 24 gram per kilogram per day, compared to term babies who are between 5 and 10. Now, if we take what we have learned before from the linear relationship into this equation, then you see that babies that have a growth rate, let's say about 8 grams per kilogram per day, like term infants, need a protein intake of 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram per day. And if you assume an intake of 150 to 160 milliliters per kilogram per day, then the protein content of this milk that you feed to the babies should be between 1 and 1.3 grams per kilogram per day, per 100 milliliters. And that is exactly the composition, the average composition of human breast milk. If we go to preterm babies with, let's say, growth rates of 18, then we need protein intakes around this, and this means that the protein content of milk should be between 2 and 3 grams per 100 milliliters, which obviously is not in breast milk and will lead to undernutrition. Yesterday, I referred to the Espegan guidelines, and still here, this is what the composition of milk should be to fulfill the Espegan guidelines if we assume a TFI of 150 to 160 milliliters per kilogram per day. And this is what is in native breast milk. So that doesn't work. We cannot go up here to this intakes or to this concentration. We could increase the TFI, but to get this here increased, we would feed babies 220 to 280 milliliters per kilogram per day. And I think many units are already scared to go above 180, though there's more and more evidence that stable babies might tolerate even up to 200. So this is milliliters, not kilocalories. So units go up to 200 milliliters per kilogram per day. But still, then we have a matched and unmatched balance because babies get far too much fat here if we double the amount of volume. So the current approach that has been put into routine in the last 20, 30 years is routine fortification. And it means that we add a human milk fortifier. I think most of the units will do that to the pumped breast milk. And what it leads to is shown in this graph. Here you see in the first 4 lactational weeks that the protein content of human milk is going down here, and this is a variability between 20 moms. And the green is here the area of the Espegan recommendations, what the content of milk should be. Now you see here that after at least one week, nearly all samples are below the recommendations. That's what I told you already before. Now, if we add fortifier, then we pump up the protein content by a fixed amount. You see here in the first 1 to 2, 3 weeks, that is still okay, though many units will not have introduced fortifiers in the first week, maybe in the second, third week, but already in the 4th week, you see here that a considerable amount of samples will have protein contents, though standard fortified will be too low, and this tendency further goes on and goes further down. And at 4 weeks, a 24 weeker is 28 weeks and still has about 10 weeks in the unit. So that is maybe not appropriate to feed the baby with this diet. And that's why literature says there's still around 60% of ELBW infants that are fed predominantly standard fortified breast milk experience extrauterine growth restriction at discharge, as I showed you before. So here you see the protein content of human milk in a meta-analysis going down from 2 grams in the first week, and here going down to 1.91, 1.1 gram, which is fine for term babies, but not for preterm babies. And there's not a big difference between preterm milk and term milk, only in the first 1 to 2, 3 weeks, but after that, there's no difference. Now, thing gets even worse with donor milk because donor milk is obtained late in lactation, so has a chronically low protein content. And there are studies, and we had the question yesterday, and I added the slides to the presentation. There are studies that show that somatic growth is indeed best with preterm formula and worse with donor human milk, and in between is mother's milk. So, and even in this study from Tufts, published in 2017, where they looked into the neurodevelopmental outcome at 2 years, interestingly, here the Bailey scores are highest with preterm and not as high as with babies that have been fed donor human milk. And in the study where we were part of, that was published in JAMA from Debbie O'Connor and Sharon Unger from Toronto, from Mount Sinai, where they looked in the effect of donor human milk compared to preterm formula, they found no difference in neurodevelopmental outcome between the two groups, though there was a pretty impressive reduction in sepsis and in necrotizing enterocolitis rate. So it was a little bit unexpected, and I did a little bit of math and said, okay, in the donor milk group, we have 3 babies with neck, and in the preterm formula, there were 10 babies with neck. So it's a difference of 7 neck babies, and the IQ points of a baby with a neck and with a non-neck baby is roughly around 25 to 30 IQs, because these babies have chronic inflammation. They do not grow very well if they have a short gut. So overall, this should have been an extra of 175 points in the donor milk group towards the donor milk group. However, if babies grow just a little bit slower, as you have seen, and this causes only 2 IQ points in each baby, then we are in the donor milk group definitely even in a deficit of IQ points, of the cumulative IQ points. So can that be proven? Because the babies should have grown differently. The problem is that if you look into to get an MDI difference of 2, you would have needed a difference in protein intake of 0.24 grams protein per kilogram per day if you take the Stevens data and calculate with it. So the delta P protein for donor milk versus mother's milk is 0.3 to 0.5 gram per kilogram per day. And a delta P of 0.24 gram per kilogram per day would result in a difference in growth rate of 1.5 gram per kilogram per day. And with that number, that was not powered to these differences in growth rates. Indeed, there is a very recent paper that came just out this year from Ting-Ting Fu, who extra supplemented babies on donor milk a priori with more protein, and could achieve now with donor milk, with this extra donor milk, extra fortified donor milk, growth rates like with mother's own milk. Now let's go back to the high intra and inter-individual variation. This is data from our group, where you see grouped in 108 mothers the content of protein in 10 to 50 samples per mother. And you see it ranges from 0.8 to 1.8 with a huge intra-individual and inter-individual variation. The same is true for fat, for carbohydrates, and for energy. This is the truth. Human breast milk is not a standardized nutrition, but highly variable. What was an eye-opener for me was this graph when we plotted the components against each other, because before I thought breast milk is either a concentrated or a diluted product, so it's only maybe a matter of how much water is in there, and you could up concentrate it. But when we plotted these against each other, you see there's a point of clouds, and that has to do that lactose, protein, and fat are secreted on completely different pathways into the human milk. So there is not such a kind of dilution, more or less water content of human milk. Indeed, the dietary composition is all over the place. And if you look this here, fat as the main source of energy and protein, and you see that there are kids with high protein but low energy, and then there are kids with low protein and high energy. Both are not very favorable diets, and we would avoid to prescribe such diets if we had it under control. Now here again, it's just from 13 mothers with more than 21 samples. You see here, this red one is definitely differently from this one or from this one. And now if we go back to this slide that I showed you before, then optimum growth we would achieve around here, also with body composition. We get 3.5 to 4 grams with enough energy, not too much energy to make babies grow here. This is the area of optimum growth and the optimum intake. This here would be an energy intake that is too high because the building blocks are being used here. And yeah, I deposit fat, I gain growth, and gain weight, but the composition of weight gain is maybe not optimum. And in this range here, you see this is suboptimal growth, this is area of restricted growth. So we would like to be here, not here, but definitely not here. Now, if we combine these two, because here we have energy intake, which is mainly a denominator here, the main contributor is fat, and here we have protein intake, which we have here. If we combine it, then you see that there are a lot of points out of the good range. And these babies will grow somehow. Yeah, we don't write the same numbers every day, but they might not grow appropriately. And why is that a problem? Because term babies have self-regulation. They might sense what is in breast milk. We do the same depending on what kind of food we eat. That we stopped earlier, a cheese fondue is differently from a meat fondue. And preterm infants but have no self-regulation. They're fully dependent on what we are filling in because most are gavage fed, and this is different to term infants. And to adjust more of an unbalanced diet does not help to fix the problems of an unbalanced diet. So is a solution. Solution is a very recent paper, just came out, I think this year. They said, okay, let's take percentiles for human protein content for different weeks, and then we can adjust the protein intake of babies. The problem is this does not predict the protein to energy level, the protein to energy intake. It only looks into protein. And what you see here, even it is done in a very detailed way for different gestational weeks, you see still that the inter-individual variability here is at least as big as the variability over time. So honestly, it does not help us in a single patient to decide where we are, because still here we experience 2.0 and here 0.8. So it doesn't help to calculate the mean. I just know that my average error that I make is smaller here compared to if I don't do that. There's a very new paper coming out that now says, okay, let's take that into account, and depending on the lactation stage, so the age of the baby, let's introduce different fortification steps, because we know that we need more when the baby gets older, because the human milk concentration goes down. And this is by calculation, what they would have achieved is they would have done that, and you see a difference in protein intake if you do this corrected model or not, and also a difference in energy intake, but the difference on energy intake is not as big as the difference in protein intake. However, these are only calculated data. It's the first approach, a great approach, but there are no clinical data that this model will work and really improve. It might improve, but the question is whether it will still be sufficient. Another study, another concept, which is called adjusted fortification, and this is the first study made, published by Hasan Loglu. And what they did is they did a randomized control trial on babies, giving them standard fortification or adjusted fortification. Adjusted fortification means that you take your blood urea nitrogen levels, and if your blood urea nitrogen level is low, then you increase. In this step-wise procedure here, you increase your fortification, and if urea stays low, you increase more until urea goes up, and if it goes up too high, then you go back again. They could show a difference in weight gain in standardized versus adjusted, and in gram per kilogram per day, it was 14.4 versus 17.5. Length gain was also different, and circumference as well. But if you see here that we have 17.5 plus minus 3.2, then there's still a large number of babies growing below 17, which I think is now the minimum that babies should achieve as weight gain. So it helps to improve this systematic error, but it doesn't help all babies. It needs blood, and the cutoff levels of BUN are arbitrary, and it's still a delay in nutrient deficit and metabolic response. So you lose time and you get step functions in the way how babies might grow. Then you can adjust. And this is basically what many units are doing. If babies are not growing on an empirical way, we do it this way. Not we, but I see it in units. Increase the feeding volume, and then we increase fortifier strengths, and then we add fat, and then we see that the baby might grow. But you lose time with this iterative approach, and there are also no published trials with high evidence that this works. So one way out could be milk analysis and individualized fortification with the goal to get a standardized intake for preemie babies. This means that you need to measure the milk content. We have done a lot of work on that about reliability, about good clinical practice. We did interlaboratory comparisons and found out how important good laboratory practice is. And I think we can say nowadays that human milk can be measured in terms of fat and in terms of protein content. And this is a study where we showed that introducing good laboratory practice in an interlaboratory approach helps really. Now, there was a first study done in 2009 that was published in 2016 from Karen Zimmer's group, and this is individualized fortification. This is the regular fortification in babies with a birth weight around 1,000 grams. And interestingly, they didn't find a difference, and discharge weight was statistically not different. That was a little bit disappointing. However, if you look into the data that they also provide, then you see that there's no difference in intake between the individualized and the regular prescription. You see that the protein intake is the same, the protein to energy ratio is the same, lipids and carbohydrates as well. So you cannot expect that babies grow differently. And to my understanding, these numbers are too low for babies. Comes on top that in this study, there was the milk analyzer was not validated and definitely had still his old diseases that they had in the beginning. So it's a question mark behind this one. This study here from 2019 compares standard fortification, adjusted fortification, and target fortification, and sees a big difference, shows a big difference between the adjusted target fortification and standard fortification in terms of weight gain, and target fortification is still superior. In this study here, a similar approach, target fortification versus adjusted fortification, you see a difference in target fortification compared to adjusted that was to be expected, to my understanding, which is considerable, 5 grams per kilogram per day, and they adjusted but only the protein intake. In this study from Sharon Grovago's group, you see also a difference in standard versus targeted group compared to fat-free mass vision. Now, there is a Cochrane review including 7 studies, and there's also our study here, which you see here by Niels Rojo. And the good thing is our study seems not to be too biased. It's all green here. Anyways, the meta-analysis concludes that there's moderate to low certainty evidence suggesting that individualized, either targeted or adjustable fortification of enteral feeds in very low birth weight infant increases growth velocity of weight, length, and head circumference during the intervention compared with standard non-individualized fortification. I find it relatively impressive that already after including 300-400 babies, we might find this difference. There are other meta-analyses that include 10,000 of babies in certain effects and still do not conclude that the intervention is helpful. So there are a few other studies on the way here from Lisbon, from Boston, from Mandy Belfort's group, and from Umeå in Sweden, and there are a few coming out, hopefully data in the next few years that will show that it works or it will not work. There's a very recent paper that came out last month from Elisabeth Olhager's group, and she also took old data and compared individualized fortification and standard fortification. And she didn't find a difference. And then has a very strong sentence: the IF method, so the individualized fortification, may be questioned since studies using other techniques for adjusting protein intake based on urea and nitrogen response in blood have reported increased weight and head circumference. That sentence is true, the second part, but I've shown you that the adjusted fortification achieves better growth compared to standard, but not as good growth as the target fortification. So this is a too strong statement from this one study. And if you look into what the problems in this study are, that she did the study in 2010 and the analyzers were not validated at that time. I think we contributed a lot with our work, that there were a little bit of adjustment being done. And these are data from our multi-laboratory comparison. Without clinical practice, you see that certain units are below, certain units measure too high, and after introducing ring trials and quality control, that improved a lot. That the study from Olhaga is before this era. If you look into what she's doing in her standard fortification group, then you see that she has a very elaborate multi-step increase protocol when the baby does not grow. And if you put so much emphasis on it, then it might be that you get the same thing as if you measure twice per week and adjust what it's missing, and the babies grow like aspirin. So the thing with the stepwise approaches is always that we need to see that the baby does not grow, which takes 3 to 4 days. Then we adjust, then it needs a metabolic response. And so we lose time here with the stepwise approaches. We'll skip this. So I come to our trial, and what you see here is it was a randomized controlled blinded trial on standard versus target fortification. And what we did here is, this is a protein content that we achieved after standard fortification. This is in the other group, what we achieved after standard fortification plus fortification. So this is the effect of target fortification. You see it pumps up the protein content of breast milk, of human milk that's being fed. The variability is much smaller compared to here. And you see another effect. These tiny little diamonds here are babies on donor milk. And you see with standard fortification, they are all below. With the target fortification, they are all close to the middle. We had also an effect on carbohydrates that is mainly due to that the North American fortifiers basically do not contain carbohydrates, but get all their extra calories with fat. And that's why the effect on fat administration was not too high. So the difference in growth rates were 2,280 in weight, was 2,280 versus 2,510 in the target group, with a significant effect. And interestingly, if we did a subgroup analysis in those babies who receive a high protein content in mother's milk versus a low protein content in mother's milk, which means the effect of the target fortification here is nearly not there, because mothers provide already a high protein content versus a low protein content. Then you see the difference in weight gain here, normal versus target fortification, there is no, where with babies from mothers with low protein content, it is even more, it's 370 grams. So ideally, this method identifies the mothers with low protein and energy content, improves it, and then babies grow the same way. These were growth rates of all our trajectories. And we also did a body composition analysis and see here that we have an increase in fat-free mass, mostly in this low protein group, which is considerable and nice, because data from Sarah Rommel show that an increase in fat-free mass also parallels an increase in neurodevelopmental outcome. We had no difference in perinatal characteristics and demographics. I should have said that in the beginning. There was a trend towards better NICU outcomes and statistically significant better tolerance of enteral nutrition in the target fortification, maybe because it's a more balanced and a more identical intake over time. We also did a neurodevelopmental outcome analysis at the age of 18 months and had these data, 95.7 versus 99.3 in the target fortification. However, we missed statistical significance on a P of 0.07 level, just missed mostly because the standard deviation in this with these measures is in the area of 10 to 12. So the numbers were too small. There was a comment from Ian Griffin recently in this published as a letter to the editor, and he said, "No, you know what, Chris, what you do is you just pump this up. Why don't you give more fortifier to everybody? Then you don't need to do all these measurements." I said, "Okay, that's a valid argument. Let's have a look again into our energy to protein plot here." And then I said, "Okay, if we do an optimized, according to his suggestion, optimized standard fortification, then we would pump up all the data that we have here in this area. This is where we should be, according to Aspergen, and this is where we would, and you see that there's still a lot of data, a lot of points outside of the recommendation. The recommendation from Aspergen plus minus 10% is here. Whereas what we achieve with our target fortification measuring 3 times per week is really being much closer and having less variability of nutritional intake, and maybe also having less under supply. Now, quickly to our experience in Nuremberg. Now, this is our device. You see, it's really a small footprint that it needs. The time needed per sample is 2 to 3 minutes, and the calculation of the target amount is also 2 minutes. We introduced it in spring 2018, and we have about 240, 280 babies so far, and we are actually compiling the data to it. This is our spreadsheet that we use, how to calculate, then in German. Also these are data of 2,400 samples that we have now measured. These are the quality control samples, fat versus protein content. And you see, basically in Nuremberg, it's not different compared to other places. The composition of breast milk is nearly all over the place. And we did some calculations. Where do we end up with standard fortification? So this range, standard fortification would provide in terms of protein content a sufficient amount in the final product. With this one, we would over fortify, we would even give too much with standard fortification, and these babies would not receive enough. Now we do the same thing here for the fat content. Then we can say standard fortification here from European-based fortifiers would achieve a sufficient energy intake. This here would need nothing at all because they are already above the red one here is the Aspergen where it starts. And these babies or these breast milk samples would need extra energy intake. So if we put that together, then you see here, this would work with standard fortification. All these here would need some other modification. These are data from our Nuremberg data. I just compiled what we had in the red cap. That is not representative for the whole sample because we started to do it retrospectively, starting from what we have now towards when we started. But you see, I think, a nice growth pattern overall. It becomes more and more consistent here in terms of how babies grow, like on tracks here, once they are here like 30 weeks, but also you see effects of very linear, very parallel growth. And we are actually extracting the data and pulling that together for these 280 babies. We also do fat-free mass and fat mass analysis with the P-pod machine, and can basically see that we have also linear accretions in a predicted way. So altogether, I would like to say that target fortification is doable. Nutrition and growth becomes part of your daily routine when you do it. You need a buy-in of staff, but the buy-in of staff comes when they see the real data and recognize what they would give but are not supposed to feed otherwise. When they see the real data, they say, oh goodness, we cannot feed this breast milk because there's no energy in there. But you can only see that if you know the data, because it's not labeled on the babe on the sample that you feed. Infants seem to be clinically more stable. There are no issues with BUN, calcium, phosphorus. We didn't have higher neck rates. There were considerably shorter lengths of stay and potentially better neurodevelopmental outcome. It also works for donor milk and also for human milk-based fortifiers. My dream is a kind of this one here, a FatMan, a fully automated target macronutrient enhancer, basically a measuring machine plus a composition machine where finally not a cappuccino comes out, but the breast milk in the right composition for the baby. I think it would be doable. So in summary, human milk is a fantastic nutritional emulsion, but was invented by Mother Nature to meet needs of term infants. They have lower growth rates and are also self-regulated. For preterm infants, human milk needs some refinement to fully benefit from the use of it, and decreasing the risk of poorer growth and potentially associated impact on neurodevelopmental outcome. Standard fortification might not be appropriate in all infants. Some might not need it at all. Some will need less and some will need more. And this is about 50% of the infants. Familiarize yourself with the fortifier use, by the way, and what you are adding to human milk, because it's product specific and different. Modern fortifiers should contain more protein and a more balanced mixture of fat and carbohydrates. For donor milk, additional supplementation using 0.3 to 0.5 gram protein per 100 milliliters seems to be reasonable. I showed you also the other data from Ting Ting Fu. Adjusted fortification may help to improve growth, but is not efficient in all preterm infants. Data about neurodevelopmental outcome are lacking. Target fortification is not a super fortification. It only identifies infants from mothers with low or unbalanced macronutrient content of native breast milk. It provides intake according to Aspergen, not more. We achieve Aspergen intakes with target fortification. And interestingly, then these babies also seem to grow like recommended by Aspergen. Data from our double-blind RCT show that target fortification improves growth compared to standard fortification, and perhaps also NDI if we would have a larger sample size. Target fortification seems to reduce the risk of poor growth in infants fed either with donor milk or an exclusive human milk diet. I haven't shown you those data. For both high-end fortification strategies, adjusted and target fortification, we need more modern modular components. They need to be developed to conserve the neck protective effect of breast milk and minimize the pro-inflammatory potential by having the right fat composition. And the variability of human milk composition is considerable and introduces a significant noise into clinical trials. And to our understanding, fortification in new RCTs only makes sense when the study design will control for this noise, which means we need to measure milk content. In addition, new study protocols should not only focus on protein, but also on energy, mainly fat content, and ideally intakes are being measured. Good laboratory practice must be followed and needs to be documented, and all these new studies need to be adequately powered. This is an impression from Nuremberg, from my group there, and I would like to thank you for your attention.